Welcome to this third session in our Toddler Talks tutorials. Hope you're finding the material helpful. Hope it's really getting you to think about your toddler group and see it in a new way and see the expansive nature of the work and the ministry that we can accomplish when we engage with early years parents and their kids. Do you know, so far we've actually looked at what it means to go deep in our relationships, what our vision is for the future, what are the little steps we need to put in place in order to make sure that our toddler group is the best and most effective that it can be. We've looked at going wide with the love of God. We've looked at how do we broaden our horizons so that we can actually look out at our community and begin to engage with it in credible and relevant ways. In this session, I want us to go long with the love of God. How do we develop and maintain long-lasting relationships with those that we connect with? I hope you'll find it helpful. The biggest challenge that we face with anything, but particularly this, is the fact that we are creatures of habit. It takes 2 minutes to make a habit. It takes years to actually break one, as anybody who has tried knows. Why? Because it's always easier to go with what we know, to stay in the status quo. And this is the way that we've always done it. It can become so easily a refrain that carries us into old age. It may not be said, but it can be a huge hold on your group or even your church. I remember a number of years ago sitting down with the 15 folk that were involved in our toddler group and presenting to them a vision of a new future. And when I asked them at the end what they'd like to do, they said, stay as we are. And every single one of the 15 said exactly the same thing. So I knew at that time that there was no chance that we could actually move things on. Since then, things have changed. Since then, COVID has happened. Since then, there's been an opportunity to look at things in a different way. And we're beginning to plan for a preferred future. Recently, we've made a major change in our toddler group. We realized that we had a greater goal than simply being a social space. So we started to develop a program. We're in the midst of doing it now, that will actually be fulfilling that vision, that preferred future that we have in mind to do. Now, don't get me wrong, we've had some resistance. Not from the mums, you understand, but from the team and the helpers. Why? For two reasons. Firstly, we've upped the expectation on them. And as you're going through this as a team, you may feel just like that. You may be sitting there in your group thinking, crumbs, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I bargained for. And that's for you to think through. You know, is it right for you to stay in the group if the group wants to move forward in this way? Or is God challenging you to change your attitude, to change your mind, to change your heart, to move on into this great adventure that could be even more effective in terms of our engagement with those that we're seeking to connect with, the parents and the toddlers? Secondly, they worry that we'll scare the mothers off. And it's true, we've lost a few. But they have more than been replaced by those who love the changes and actually, in truth, don't know any different. Now, this may be the biggest challenge that you face as you begin to apply what you learn from these sessions. But listen, take a piece of advice from somebody who knows and has been there before. Weather the storm, because at the end of the day, it will be worth it to see your group functioning effectively, to see people coming to faith in Christ through it, to see people's parenting skills grow, to see children going into school more confident because they've had time to spend with you. The truth is that you will step back into your group, into its normality, and you will discover just how hard it is to change anything. But we must develop and grow, or we will die. That's true of the church, and that's true of every aspect, every ministry, every program within it. The choice is that stark. The church is in decline, and we are going to go down with it unless something changes. if we're to truly make a difference and make the most of the opportunity Toddler Group gives, particularly where mission is concerned, we have to think differently. We have to step outside the box. We have to take courage in both hands and plan accordingly. So take a few moments to have a chat with your team. Be honest with one another. Tell one another what you're struggling with, both in terms of these tutorials, in terms of the life of the group itself, and in terms of the prospect of change. Because it isn't until we get it out in the open and talk about it that we can ever do anything to resolve any issues. And if you find yourself in a situation where every single member of your team says no, then the chances are this is not God's timing for making change. So give it a moment and think those things through. Pause the video now and take those few moments. Okay, let's continue, shall we? And I think it was Albert Einstein who actually said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And yet, isn't that so true of church? We sort of hope and pray that the world will change and come back to the way that it was in the 1950s. We sort of hope that we'll arrive back at that place where the church was in its ascendancy. Do you know, the church was the largest it has ever been in the history of this country in 1934. It's been a steady decline from that moment to this. And part of the reason I think for that is because we got stuck in a rut. We stopped changing, we stopped developing, we stopped being as responsive to the society in which we're set as we had been in the past. Now, that doesn't mean agreeing with everything that's going on around you, but it does mean adapting not the message, but the means of communication, the way that we do things, in order that we might engage with the needs that we see around us. And sadly, that's what we've tended to do. We've tended to try doing the same thing over and over and over again. And if we're to be truly fruitful in our chosen area of ministry, we must move on. You know, what worked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago doesn't work now. In my church, we have a phrase for this. It goes like this: if we could get to where we want to go by staying as we are, we'd be there by now. Let me say that again. If we could get to where we want to go by staying as we are, we would be there by now. And whenever I say it, people laugh and they go, well, yeah, there's a logic to that, isn't there? And it's true, isn't it? You know, if we are not seeing the outcomes we want, then the reality is something has to change. And in all our sessions, we're looking to suggest ways to change, or at the very least, mechanisms that allow you to find your own way to do so. And it all starts, as it always does, with motivation. What motivates you to do Toddler Group? Why do you turn up every week? Why is it that you're in this training session now? Is it simply because your Toddler Group leader said it's a 3-line whip and you've got to be there? Or are you there because you have some passion within you to see toddlers reached and parents helped? After all, the pay isn't great, is it? You know, the task is hard. There's very little thanks for what you do. So why not take a moment to just turn to someone near you and tell them the reason why you do it? Why do you come? Why do you help in Toddler Group? What's your passion and your vision for this work? Fantastic. Well, having thought about that, having thought about your motivation, I want to tell you what mine is. My motivation increasingly in all I do is the love and the presence of God. The love of God compels me, motivates me to get out of bed in the morning, motivates me to come to church. You know, sometimes I feel a bit like that head teacher, you know, who wakes up in the morning and says to his mother, I don't want to go to school today. I hate school. It's horrible. They're all mean to me. And the mother says, but you have to go, son. You're the headmaster. And I feel sometimes like that. I feel like, you know, I don't want to go to church. I find church really difficult. They're really mean to me. And somebody saying to me, you've got to go. You're the pastor. And yet sadly, that's how we can feel. We can feel ground down, can't we, by the task? And that can be true in toddler group as much as it can in terms of church and ministry. But I love the verse from Ephesians that we're building this training tutorial material around. And here it is on the screen, Ephesians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. What a great verse. What a great prayer. What a great passion that we might know the love of God and share the love of God with those around us. And I hope that's your dream. I hope that's your passion, because it acts as a scaffold for me. It acts as inspiration for me. And I hope it will for you in all that you do. If we're to see parents and children rooted and established in agape love, because that's what Paul is talking about here, in all our planning, in all our strategizing, in all our vision, we need to have this constantly at the top of our agenda. How do we show? How do we share with each one of them how wide and long and high and deep is the love of God? That's what we're thinking about. How do we do that? And that's what I want to consider again in this session. In our first two sessions, we explored how we go deep and how we go wide. Sort of reminds me of a song, but you have to be a certain age to understand that. How we deepen the relationships, how our goals for the group, how we widen our mission field and engage with other families, with early years children. In this session, I want us to explore how we expand our reach, how we go long. You know, one of the things that really challenged me when I was a toddler group leader the last time, and continues to challenge me now, is the fact that time is short. We don't have time to dither about. Did you know that you have 1,277 days to make a difference in the lives of those who attend your group? Why? Because that's the average time between birth and nursery, 3.5 years. Which means that if the parents bring their children to your baby group the moment they are born, you have 150 hours effectively to make a difference. Why? Because they don't spend every waking moment with you. They come once a week during term time. And that's not long. 1.5 hours a week. That's not a long time to make a difference and to have an impact and exert influence. And we need to recognize the reality of that. Time is short, and therefore we need not only to make the most of the time, but we also need to effectively use the time. So let me ask you a question. For a person to decide to follow Christ, from the moment they first meet a Christian, how long does it take? How long does it take for a person to decide to follow Christ from the moment they first meet a Christian? Do you know? The answer is 4 to 7 years. And it's actually getting longer. It's getting longer. But, and the reality is that that's a long time, isn't it? But it gets worse, because if our aim is to share the gospel, to show and share the love of God, and invite them to take a journey into faith, the statistics show that it takes on average that 4 to 7 years from first contact for them to make a decision whether they even want to consider the possibility of following Christ or not. And if you think about it, that makes sense. After all, how many of you would walk down the street and decide to turn your whole world, your whole life upside down because someone approaches you with a message? My guess is that no one will, though I know by miraculous means sometimes it can happen. But it's far more likely that people will want to check it out. They'll try it on for size. They'll watch you for a while to see whether you are the real deal, and before they even consider listening to what you have to say. So it's vital that we think very carefully about how we might lengthen the time we have with them. Because the reality is, if you ask the question, how many years will they attend Toddler? The truth is that it's only between 1 and 3 years. So there's a shortfall, isn't there? If they're only going to be with us for 3 years maximum, and it takes 4 to 7 years for them to actually make some sort of decision, then the reality is that they aren't likely to do it in our group unless we seek to lengthen the time that we have with them. And so that's why I want to think about going long. I want us to think about it because there is a shortfall. Now, in order for us to consider how we might do that, we need to recognize the relevance, the importance of the first 2 sessions. If we're going to go deep in relationship, we build the quality of the quantity of time that we have with the parents and with the toddlers. If we're going to go wide, we're going to actually scatter the message of God's love out to a greater group of people, in order that we might draw them into something that the church is doing. And much of what we shared in those first 2 sessions was based broadly on what's called the Engel scale. And here's a picture, one illustration of what the Engel scale is about, if you've never seen it before. It's a way of describing the journey, the process, the little steps that people take between having no background in faith, no understanding of the gospel, and no interaction with the church, to the point where they actually are fully devoted as followers of Christ. They're getting out there and they're sharing the gospel with their friends, they're praying, they're reading their Bible, they're worshipping God, they're doing all the things that make for a full and fulsome Christian life. And there are these steps, these stages, in order that they might, in order that we might understand where they are on the scale. Now, it's a very established way of looking at the journey into faith and then through faith into discipleship. But the trouble with it is that we either look at it and go, oh, that's interesting, and then don't sort of move on, don't consider its implications. Or the other problem is that we use it and we use it badly. We use it wrong. And the question that will really change the way we consider the Engel scale and the way we use the Engel scale is, what must we measure? Their progress, the progress of those who come into our group, or our progress as the group, as the planners, as the strategists, as the visionaries? Sadly, too often, if this scale is used at all to help the church connect with people, it's used badly. Why? Because we failed to ask that question. You see, too often we've tried to pigeonhole people and categorize them, not realizing that people don't neatly fit into one of these steps. At one and the same time, they can be at stage 4 and at stage 7 at one and the same time, sometimes even in the same sentence. If the scale is to be helpful, we don't need to use it to measure their progress, but measure our own progress. We need to ask, are we creating opportunity for people to journey towards Christ no matter where they are currently on the Engel scale? So you see what I'm saying? We're not measuring the people. We're not getting them coming through the door and going, oh, you're a 10, you're a 7, you're an 8. What we're doing is we're measuring the church. We're measuring the toddler group. What are we doing within the toddler group or around it, providing with other groups in order to help people to take their next step, wherever that step may be? Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm actually trying to say here? We're putting in little steps that are helping people on a journey. And if they're at stage 2, then we've put in the step for them to go to stage 3 or stage 4, or miss out any steps that they like, because there's always a step that will catch them. That's really important. And I hope I've clarified it and made it clear to you. So as we think about going long, we need to, need to take time. Time may be short, but this whole process of putting in the steps takes time. So our sense of urgency needs to be tempered with one of the most freeing facts I think I've ever experienced where mission and evangelism and witness are concerned. It's this: I don't make people Christian. I can get in the way of that progress. I can play my part and make my contribution. But at the end of the day, I don't make people Christian, and neither do you. God does. The Holy Spirit does. We play our part, obviously, but it's God who makes the difference. It's God who makes up for our shortcomings. It's therefore not down to me to bring them through to faith, but rather help them to take the next step. So my suggestion is that as you consider lengthening the time and the influence you have on those who come to your group, you need to pace yourself. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will this be. You know, if you look at your group and you go, well, actually, everybody's at level step 8 or 9 or 10, then in your planning, in your strategizing, in your envisioning, make sure that you put in place things that will help to get them from 7 to 6 to 5. As well as doing those things that already are appealing to them to bring them into the group itself. And over the course of time, continue to build the steps as you get people that seem to be in that place and wanting that sort of help and support. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to do everything we suggest. In fact, the truth is you don't have to do any of it. And it's a wonder to me that we've got to session 3 and you're still watching. But you need to take the next step and plan not only for that step, but for the one after that. So maybe you need to ask yourself, what's the one thing from what you've heard so far that you need to take away and implement this month, this quarter, this half year, this year? Pause the video just for a minute and think about that question. Let me say it again because it won't come up on the screen. What's the one thing from what you've heard so far that you can take away and implement this week, this month, this quarter, this half year, this year? Think intentionally, think strategically, think deep, think wide, think long, and come to your own conclusions. Fantastic. Well, the second thing to say is that we need to think strategically. You know, we need to think about what we're doing. That's what we're doing in this tutorial, aren't we? We're thinking strategically. We're taking it apart like a jigsaw puzzle, and we're putting it back together, hopefully by using the clue on the box lid in order that we might become what God would have us be. And it's really important that we actually do that. You see, ultimately, what we're aiming for is for church to be from cradle to grave. How do we engage people? This is what the church leadership should be thinking. This is what the church leadership should be doing. And if your church leadership probably needs a helping hand on this, then let me tell you that we're putting together at the moment a new set of tutorials called Bridging the Gap that will help a church leadership go through a similar process to what you're going through here, that will help them to think through the issues related to church and the steps that they need to put in place in order that your church, no matter how big or small it might be, starting where it is, might begin to expand so that it reaches out to people from cradle to grave and engages with the reality of people's lives. Now, that's probably not something that you need to think about. It's someone else's task. But your part in it is to ask yourself 2 questions. And maybe ask your church leaders the same 2 questions. How do we plan to plug people into the things we offer as a church? Now, that's really important, isn't it? There's no point providing something that nobody wants to come to. And too often that's what we do. You know, in many respects, that's what we've been doing with our evening services in the church where I serve for the past 10 years. We're offering things that very few people actually want to come to. Now, maybe that's a question of timing, or it's a question of exhaustion, or it's a question of other things going on in people's lives. But the reality is that we have to face the issue. We can't just stick our head in the sand and pretend like it isn't there. We've got to ask, how do we plan to plug people into the things we offer as a church? And if we can't plug them in, then maybe we need to get rid of that thing that we're offering as a church and do something new. You see, if we have them for 3.5 years on average, and it takes twice as long for them to come to faith, then we need to think through how we're going to maintain the relationship for a further 3.5 years. So it makes sense, doesn't it? And then secondly, we need to recognize the gaps in what we offer as a church and ask ourselves, how do we fill them? How do we reach out to mums and dads in their 20s and 30s? How do we reach out to older teenagers? How do we reach out to young men and young women? Because that's where the gap is in the context of church, and we need to be challenged by that. I remember talking to the minister at Hereford Baptist Church many years ago now, and he was saying that the area around his church building had changed. It had gone from a residential area to an area where all the nightclubs life was, and there they were smack in the middle of it. And when he came to the church, they were talking about building a brick wall to stop people peeing up against the church and keep them out. And one of the older people stood up and said, that seems like a wrong thing to do. We're not trying to keep people out. We want them to come in. So I don't sleep very well and I don't sleep very much. How about if I open the church between the hours of sort of 11 and 3 when they're coming out of the nightclubs and offer them the toilets, offer them a drink, offer them a warm space, offer them a chat. And that's what they did. A group of them got together, began to open the church. And over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, they ended up with something called Night Shift, which was an evening, a service that took place at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it had hundreds coming to it. Now that's inventive, that's imaginative, that's thinking outside the box, that's extending your reach, that's going long in terms of, and it's filling a gap, but it's filling a gap according to the needs of those that you're seeking to reach. And we would do well to learn from that. Hey, there's a free illustration because it just came to me. So I hope you find that helpful. So as we begin to think about how we go long, I want to use the circle in the middle of the paper as another way of doing it and suggest some little steps that we need to consider as toddler group leaders that may not pertain to the group, but may pertain to the things that the church is doing around the group that you will be able to utilize, access, link to, and do so consciously and deliberately in order to extend your reach. It's important as we think about going long that we recognize that this is not something that we can do or we should do alone. There should be little steps within the group if we're to develop the relationship. Then there should also be little steps between what we do and other things that the church can offer each member of the family, the parents, the carers, the children, the grandparents, let's say, the friends, whoever it might be. Someone in my church said recently that this church is like a magnet. It draws you in and it doesn't let go of you. Now, I'm not sure whether they meant that as a criticism or a compliment, but the reality is it's true, isn't it? It's true. That's how we should be. We should sort of draw people in, attract people to, and then we should be able to keep them if we're going to see the church and those individuals grow. And there's a reason. We are intentionally planning for this to be the case. Now, sometimes we do it well and other times we do it badly. We are not a perfect church, but the truth is that we are thinking about it, and that's important. Now, you may feel that it's not your job to do this, but it is something that the Entheos Trust can help your leaders with. And we have 2 other tutorials that we're developing and have developed called Bridging the Gap and Fit for Purpose that are designed to help church leaderships get their teeth into strategic thinking and build on what you are already succeeding in and doing. But for now, every new project, every new development must be designed to create another little step into longer and deeper relationship, not just with us, but hopefully given time with Jesus. In fact, in my church, we will not take on a new project unless and until it can push out and plug in to other things we do. So think about your group. What are the things you could or should be doing that act as potential interface between your group and the rest of the church? Look at what you are and ask, what are we doing to plug people in to other things? And so think about your group. And think about that. And here are a few examples of the sort of things I'm talking about, just to give you a bit of a lead in and a bit of a help. The most obvious one, I guess, is children's work. How is your toddler group encouraging the children in your group to plug into other things that the church provides for children? Are those things sufficiently credible and relevant for you to feel comfortable making the link? If they aren't, have a conversation with the children's workers and see what you can do to make that more effective. You know, if your group is a social group, what can you do to expand their repertoire, their access to other social events that potentially the church could lay on that will help them to interact with other Christians? You know, what about parenting courses? You know, could you provide parenting courses that you can invite others from other departments to come to, so there's a mix and mingle of different parents from different contexts so that they can recommend whatever else it is that you're doing? What about seniors work? If you've got grandparents in your group, then why not plug them into some of the stuff that the seniors are doing? What about targeted events that will help your group to engage with others with similar interests? What about the women's work? What about youth work and schools work and pastoral care? The list, when you begin to think about it, is endless, and it's really important that we consider those things and our place and part and plugging in to each and every one of them. Now, you may not be in a position to make new projects happen all over your church. I mean, that is definitely not your job, is it? Unless you have a sense of calling and leading into pastoral ministry or into some other specialism. But what you can do is allow new projects to develop as an extension of your work, the work that you're already doing. Become a vision caster, become a catalyst to others. Isn't that what I'm doing in this series? And isn't that what I'm encouraging you to do in terms of what you're involved in? Now, let me illustrate this for you. Here's a picture of what one church is doing to deepen their engagement with those that they have contact with. We've seen this chart again before, haven't we? And I'm just showing it to you again because I think it might be helpful. You know, now one of the projects that I mentioned to you was Who Let the Dads Out? Do you remember? It's sort of at the bottom of the screen, WLTDO. And I was up at Dronfield Baptist Church near Sheffield a few years ago, and there was a guy there who was new to the church. And as we stood in the queue for lunch at the church weekend that I took for them a couple of years ago, he told me he was passionate to reach men. That was his thing. And he told me that he tried the usuals. He tried men's breakfasts and he tried men's Bible studies and such like, but nothing seemed to have worked. And he was a bit discouraged, if the truth be known. And I said to him, if you try and reach men as men, you will fail. But if you try to reach them through the things that matter most to them, you will succeed. Which is a sort of obvious statement, isn't it? It's what we've been doing in Toddler Group. We're reaching women through their kids, through Toddler Group. It sort of applies. And I used the illustration that I'd just given. And at the end of the time, he came up to me and he said, I've had a chat with the leader of our Toddler Group, and we're going to start a Who Let the Dads Out group after half term. Now, what did I do? I cast the vision. What did he do? He took the bait. And as a consequence, he began to engage with men through the desire that their wives had, their spouses and partners had, for them to engage more fully with their children. It was an oblique connection that began a new ministry. Now, who knows what else might develop from that? And the next screen gives some suggestions. So here's your parent and toddler group. And out of your parent and toddler group, you have your Who Let the Dads Out that's just started. And from Who Let the Dads Out and what it's establishing, it begins its own little step process that begins to expand outwards and begins to foster and develop new ministries. You know, a men's matters study group, a dads and daughters weekend, a dads and lads weekend, journeys, a pre-alpha course, pub night, a making project like the car in the car park that I mentioned to you in session 2. You know, sport, great way of connecting with men. Missions trips where they can go and be macho and do manly things in places that desperately need to see plumbing or sanitation or whatever it might be. And then there's BESM, which is an organisation that helps to link together social services and the needs within social services where individuals are concerned, and the manpower of the church, the woman power of the church to be able to meet those needs. We did that in one of the churches where I served, and it was fantastic. We had men going along and decorating women's houses who'd been victims of violence and abuse, and had fled from their hometowns and found themselves where we were based, and they did something that really made them feel fulfilled, and in the process they got to know other men. They felt like they were making a difference, and they were undermining the prejudice of that woman about men and how men are and how men act, and that was hugely significant. And so those are some ideas. And it's just designed to be illustrative. It's to give you an idea of ways that you can begin to reach long and begin to encourage and catalyze the establishment of other initiatives that will make a difference over time and develop a new ministry and new effectiveness. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Think about that and maybe share that with others. In order that they might think about it, and you will be catalysing something that will make your group so much more effective and the church so much more able. Okay, well let's move on, and let me talk just for a moment about what I've called multi-touch. What's multi-touch? Well, if we're aiming to create as many opportunities to build relationship, what we're doing is we're creating points of influence. And as we've already said, the statistics suggest that it can take 4 to 7, maybe up to 10 years for people to make a positive decision to follow Christ. The less we engage as church, the longer the time is getting. But it can be shortened by the number of touches we have. And by that I mean the number of places the gospel positively touches their lives and the lives of those around them. So what we're looking to do is to make multiple touches through multiple ministries into the lives of these individuals. Let me give you 2 examples. Here's the first one. Due to a long-term connection with church people, an elderly lady, Val, decided to come to church. She found friendship, she found welcome, she found faith. She invited her daughter, Sam, to come to church, and Sam went, "No way am I ever darkening the doorsteps of a church." And Val said, "Well, you don't have to, because this church is run in a cafe." Now, Sam liked coffee, she liked cake, she knew the cafe, she felt comfortable going into the confines of the cafe. And when her mother told her that actually it used modern music and it didn't necessarily use Christian music, she thought, whoa, I like music. And so there were immediately 3 virtual touches that made her think about coming along. And she came along, she loved it. We didn't do a traditional preach. We usually had somebody come in and talk about their testimony, or they came in and they talked about, faith and science, or they talked about something that, suffering, whatever it might have been, and from a personal perspective. And she became a regular. Now, Val's great-grandson, Sam's grandson, Mason, came to Holiday Club, unbeknownst to mum and great-grandma and grandma, and he loved it. And as a result, he decided to come to Messy Church, but only if his grandma, Sam, would come with him. And when he invited her, Sam suddenly realized that he was involved in the same church that she was, so she came along. Now, what's going on there? There are multiple touches going on through multiple generations that are beginning to engage with a whole family, and that was really exciting. And then Emma, a church member who herself had come to faith through the invite of a friend, bumped into Sam while we were doing a thing called Blessings for a Bad Day on Friday the 13th. We were out on the streets, we were asking some questions about superstition and things like that and getting into conversation. And Emma told Sam about Alpha. And Sam agreed to come because of the recommendation that was being made from somebody who was themselves credible. And Sam, now, having come to faith and being baptized, goes out into the streets and talks to others. What happened? 3 lives were touched time and time and time again. Here's the second illustration. Whilst advertising our holiday club in one of the school playgrounds, a grandmother asked where the church was. Touch 1. She was moving into the McCarthy and Stone retirement buildings behind the church. Her grandson came to holiday club. Touch 2. And when the grandmother moved into the block, the church took round a welcome cake. Touch 3. She said to her daughter and grandson she was thinking of attending that kind of church, the kind church that had welcomed her. Her grandson said he wanted to come too, so the daughter said she would come as well. Touch 3. Touch 4. And this meant 3 generations made a connection. Let me give you another illustration just to round it off. We've a significant number of older people in our church, and recently that new McCarthy and Stone retirement home opened behind our church. 3 of our members moved in and began to befriend. Touch 1. Our pastoral care team took in welcome to your new home cakes, and they sent flowers and a card to every new resident. We invited them to come to our lunch club. 2 more touches. No one came. Then 3 started to come, and they invited their friends, and their friends came. We run Classic Church and Monday Club. Monday Club is a little step on from Lunch Club, and Monday Club goes on holiday together. So you see what we're doing? We're creating little steps that are leading people along a journey that they want to take. We're not coercing. We're not looking to persuade. We're just simply saying these are other things we do. And because they're credible and relevant, people are engaging with them. Our aim, therefore, is to be to increase the number of positive connections that people have with Christians and church, and through them Jesus. Now those 3 examples weren't about Toddler Group, but the principle still applies. The fascinating thing is that when we think of Toddler Group, we tend to think of toddlers. We may think of parents, but the truth is that grandparents, carers and nannies come to toddler groups. How are we connecting with them? How are we meeting their needs? I once spoke with a toddler leader who was telling me of her frustration that they could not reach parents. I've mentioned this before because they all worked and they didn't come to the group. And she said she tried everything and nothing seems to have worked. So I said to them, well, how did the children come? Because they surely don't come on their own. And she said, oh, the nannies bring them. So I said, well, maybe God isn't calling you to reach parents. Maybe he's calling you to reach nannies. And she was so fixated, so locked into a paradigm that she'd not been able to see outside of the box. And her eyes lit up and she went, we can do that. Because the reality is they were already doing that. And they began to actually think about and plan how they could create little steps in order to meet the needs of nannies, which are quite particular, quite specific, and quite different to those of parents. You see, her blinkeredness had created a blockage for development and growth in her group. Another church started a grannies and nannies group because they had a great number and a real need. And the other thing to say, though, is that churches often provide other opportunities for contact with grannies, but we don't plug them in to those opportunities. We need to consciously and deliberately do so, because engaging with grannies is something we actually do quite well, and we need to recognize the reality of that. So there you go. That's quite a lot to think about. Multi-touch, touching people's lives and those around them in different ways. But if we're going to go long, then that's something that we need to really recognize. So what are the other things that we need to think about? Well, we've already thought about pacing ourselves and thinking strategically, but what about connecting with what already exists? What about growing what doesn't? That's what we've been talking about, haven't we? And it's important that if you have a nursery on site, you get the leader to come down to the group and become known by the group. That's what we're doing at the moment. I think I mentioned this already. We're changing the name of our toddler group to Caterpillars in order that it might verbally plug into our butterflies nursery that meets every week of a morning in the same building. And by doing so, we are consciously and deliberately creating that next step. We're deliberately making those connections. Now, that may seem obvious, but it certainly has been obvious to the church in which I'm set for the last 30 years, which seems a little silly, but shows how blinkered we can be. Now, if they leave to go to school, and your church goes into the school, then make sure that someone they recognise is part of the team that goes into the school. It's sort of obvious, isn't it? You know, if they go from toddler, not through nursery, into reception, or if they go from your toddler group into your nursery into reception, then when they arrive at reception, the first assembly that you do ought to have somebody that they've seen in toddler group and nursery, and now they see in reception. It makes a huge difference, because they'll run out of the playground that day and they'll say, Mummy, you'll never guess who I saw. I saw Richard from toddler group. I saw Richard from nursery, or whoever it might be. And therefore, it's really quite important that we do multi-touch in the schools if we're lengthening the time that we have relationship with those families. So we offer reading support for children that are struggling. We go in and do the Open the Book project, or our version of it. And we offer parenting skills, life skills, and ESOL, and money management, and internet safety. And then we offer CHOMP, which I've mentioned before, which is a food poverty provision that happens during the half terms. You know, if you have children of the same age, it's important that the friendship spills out of the group into the playground at picking up time. And before we take a moment to think about that, let me lay before you one other thought about going long, and it's this: pass them on. Pass them on. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to be there to make all the connections, because actually that's a full-time ministry, isn't it? And unless you feel called to that, then that's not actually what you're trying to do. But actually, you can pass them on. Make sure that you know you're responsible to make sure the transition from one group, your toddler group, to the nursery is your responsibility to make sure it happens really well and happens really effectively. And that leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about creating continuity. A couple of years ago, I spoke at the Care for the Family Playtime Conference in Sheffield. And during a break, I met a toddler group leader who told me that her church had two toddler groups. One ran on a Monday and was for 0s to 3s, and the other ran on a Friday and was for 3s to 6s. One ran in the morning on the Monday, the other ran after school in the evening on the Friday. Now, the reason they did it on the Friday was because actually the kids could recover the following day if they'd been out for a long time-ish on that Friday. And in that way, they were creating continuity. They were making little steps from their group to the next. Are we planning this? Are we being intentional about it? She certainly was, and I thought that was a genius idea if you've got the manpower, the enthusiasm, the courage to actually think along those lines. And I hope you have, and I hope you will. Okay, well, let me ask, if we were to do so, what might it look like for us? That's a really important question, isn't it? If we were to do so, what might it look like for us? What might we need to ask that question? You know, what might it look like? Well, What might it look like for the children? And think about it. If we're going to lead the children from toddler group into nursery and from nursery into reception, if we're going to walk with them along that journey, what does that look like? What do we need to put in place? How does it need to work? So here's a suggestion. They come to what we at the moment call pram and pushchair that will turn into caterpillars. And that's for the 0s to 3s. And then potentially we could have trikes and bikes. Now, we're not going to call it that, and that's not what it's going to be. It may become chrysalis or grubs or something. I have no idea. I haven't really thought about that. We're probably going to plug into the nursery and do it that way. But you could set up another group on a Friday, as that lady had done in her church, and call it trikes and bikes, because if pram and pushchair are about being pushed, trikes and bikes is bringing your own transport, and that may be an interesting thing to do. And then there could be a junior youth club, something that follows on from trikes and bikes. That, so let's say that happens from home time from school and runs through till 5:15. And then at 5:30, there's Junior Youth Club, and that runs from 5:30 till 7 o'clock. And then from Junior Youth Club, there's Youth Club that runs from 7 o'clock through till 9. You see what you're doing? You're planning to lead them along a path, to take a journey. And it's an interesting concept and an interesting idea. And then maybe you do Youth Alpha. And over the course of a period of time, 0 to 7 or 8, 9 or 10, 11 or 12, you're actually taking them long. That's the point, isn't it? To take them long. Maybe you then plug them into youth worship and help them to actually engage there. And maybe you have a youth group where you turn them around and begin to use them in order that they might support those new ones coming up. And effectively, by illustrating it like that, by looking at one specific group, the children, what you're doing is you're sort of unwinding one strand of your toddler group and going along with it and seeing where it might end up. And and it's only possible to develop those little steps around the project or ministry that you are part of, but you can also unwind each step and develop a strand that will become itself little steps. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Because it sort of doesn't make any sense, does it? Well, here's just one example. What you could do is to unwind the strand that starts in your group with song time. Every week in the group, you get them together on carpet and you sing songs. Some kids love that. Others sort of, other parents, but it's a way of beginning to engage using music. And you might actually decide to develop from that a sort of music with mummy group that engages with that particular subject. Or you might start a music and movement session that happens once a month in your group where that's the main focus. And then you might introduce a toddler service where there's more singing, and we do that 3 times a year. And then you could start something called Music Makers. Music Makers is a great initiative. If you look it up on Google, it's a bit like Who Let the Dads Out, but it uses music as a means to create a toddler group experience. And then that might link into Messy Church once a month, or it might look to dovetail into All Together services, or it might dovetail into a children's choir or a youth choir or a parents' choir. You're using music as a means to build the strand and build the relationship and go long. Now, the aim in doing something there is to take them from group to Sunday, no, that's probably not helpful actually, to take them from group through song to worship, and from worship through to choir, and from choir through to church. You're creating a process, you're creating a journey from group to church to faith, and that's something that you're seeking to do. Does that make sense? Have I explained that well enough? If I haven't, then let me know, and I'll clarify it for you. Now, that will be one of multiple strands that we could potentially put in place. You know, we need to recognize the more we can make church familiar, the more we can expose them to enjoyable, positive experiences, the more open they'll be to exploring what faith is all about. And so to do something like that, you know, from song time to toddler service to music makers to messy church, into an altogether service that is designed with them in mind, is a great way of unwinding one strand. Now, you could do that by way of care, you could do that way of support, you could do that way in terms of the training courses that you offer, you could do it in all sorts of different ways, but it is worth giving consideration to. And we need to recognize the reality of that. So let's pause for a moment, because I don't know about you, but that was quite a lot to take in and quite a lot to think about. And let's ask ourselves a few questions. You know, how are we doing where these things? How are we doing this for our parents? How are you doing this thing already, almost naturally, without even thinking about it? And how might you develop it? What would the stages be if you were to unpick a thread, a strand? Have you got people in place in the life of the church that you could plug into that will make that possible? And are they age related, or are they life stage related? That's another thing that's worth giving some thought to, isn't it? And is really, really important and really helpful. So let's pause for a moment and think just about that. Okay, well, let's carry on, shall we? Because we've got a little bit further to go. And I wanted to say, and I wanted to stress, because, you know, these 3 sessions have shown that there's an awful lot that you could do. There's an awful lot of potential. And I want to say it just again, because I don't want you to feel completely overwhelmed by what you're receiving in this material. The beauty of doing it this way is you can press pause at any time. You can stop and go, whoa, that's enough for now, and come back to it 6 months later or 3 months later or whatever. That's entirely up to you. What I'm not looking to do is to overwhelm you. What I am looking to do is to expand your horizons, that you might extend your reach and enable you to see things in a different light if you've not seen them before. And that's really important. It's really important that we're able to think like this, you know. So think deep. That's the place to start. Think about, how do you deepen the relationships? What vision have you got for your group, and how are you going to meet it? Think about the little steps that you put in place in order to make this a positive experience and a journey that you might realize your goals and help people to become all that they can be. Think about, how do you go wide? Maybe that's something that you are just on the brink of doing, and that session helps you. Or maybe it's something that actually you're not prepared for yet. It's something that's way in the distance, if ever, in which case you can ignore that session and not consider that material at all. Think about how you go long. Think about, how do we develop the relationship? I think in some ways that's so critical, isn't it? If it takes 4 to 7 years for people to consider the possibility of coming to faith, and up to 10 years for them to be established, then we need to lengthen the time and think strategically about how we plug in, how we connect with the other things that we do in the life of the church. And I really want to encourage you to do just that. So that's it. That's the end of this session. I hope you found it helpful. I'm sorry if it's come out a bit like a machine gun, but the beauty is you can go back and you can actually look at it again, and you can make the pauses bigger if you want to. But I hope you found it helpful, and I hope it will give you plenty of food for thought, because that's the point, isn't it? That's what we're here for. And again, let me just repeat, love to hear from you. Why not look at our website, where there's loads of resources that we're beginning to develop and put up in place there that are designed to help you. And if you want to drop me a line by email, the link is on the screen. In fact, I'll make it larger so that you can you can see it much more clearly than you can now. And if you'd like to actually email me and drop me a line, then I'd love to have a conversation with you and see what we can do to help. And but I look forward to seeing you in session 4. We're almost there. We're almost at the end of this series. And I hope you found it helpful so far. This is probably the thing that I'm most passionate about that we'll see in session 4. So do join us. Thanks for watching.